Hello to everyone. I hope you are all well. So let me welcome you. I see you are still connecting. So I would like to propose that we take just a few minutes, like 5 minutes maximum, so that we can start after that. I'm also inviting participants to try and connect so that we can start as quickly as possible. So please continue connecting, and then we will actually start shortly in 5 minutes maximum. Thank you for your patience. Thank you. Let's start. Good morning, everyone. So we are now going to start our webinar. This is our second webinar after the one that took place in November to launch the KIX Observatory. Let me first thank you, particularly the speakers today. Will be focusing more on interaction. We would like to make sure that we can hear from country representatives and the experience around this time of COVID-19. So without taking too much time, so let me request my colleague, Ms. Rita Bisono, the head of mission of the African Union CFA, to introduce the webinar and actually share the objectives, and then we'll proceed accordingly. Dr. Rita?
Thank you very much, Mr. Albert. Good morning, good afternoon, honorable ministers, dear partners, KIX focal points, ladies and gentlemen. It is with great honor today that I welcome you to this webinar series organized by the consortium comprising of VIDEA, the Association for the Development of Education in Africa, the African Union International Center for Girls and Women's Education in Africa, with the technical support of UNESCO UIS and the African Population and Health Research Center, APHRC. The theme for today's webinar is Education Financing, Wellbeing, and Schools Reopening. And to this effect, the consortium has published on its KIX website, which you might have seen already, reports on both education financing and well-being of school children. These publications highlight current policies and practices in Africa and offer practical homegrown solutions to share and exchange amongst all of us, the decision makers in working in education. According to the data that is before COVID, the pre-COVID data, it was already estimated that we had 40% of children, including IDPs and refugees, who were considered to have a low level of well-being. That is not having enough water, not having enough sanitation, poor nutrition, and not enough space, safe spaces for having a basic education. And with COVID-19, with this pandemic, these numbers have increased, as have gender inequalities, which have intensified during school closures. And this has, of course, impacted on human capital development and the productivity, as fewer girls have had access to continued learning during this COVID times. This webinar today will highlight perspectives from member states on their financial expenditure, including the gender equality dimension towards assuring and ensuring continued learning in Africa during this pandemic. That is, how are boys and girls benefiting from the share of resource allocations? As we know, it is very difficult for our countries to trade off between addressing health-related COVID-19 priorities and educational priorities. Substantial resources are necessary to keep our schools open and to ensure continued learning during the time that schools were closed. These are compelling and competing priorities for the few available resources in our countries. Moreover, houses in Africa have a balance between meeting everyday needs and education expenditures. And this poses a risk for our children, especially those who are being forced to child labor, being exposed to child marriage. As we know, in many families, livelihoods are diminishing as the economic crisis continues. There is hope in the horizon, especially as all of you partners are here today in the education development sector. We meet and we look at evidence to take action. At our own level, at the African Union International Center for Girls and Women's Education for Africa, we have launched an Africa Educator campaign. This is to ensure that girls go back to school. It is also to make our member states aware that there is need for increase in domestic financing, for catch-up strategies, and to ensure that schools reopen fully, especially in remote areas, in conflict situations, in humanitarian settings. Furthermore, our own strategic plan, our third strategic plan for 2021 to 2025, uses the theory of change basing itself on the gender intelligence dimension to make sure that we go towards our goal of gender equality and that we include boys and girls in the discussion, in the dialogue, and we value each other's contributions to trigger a new mindset that enables both genders to operate in a spirit of partnership in the education development sector. In conclusion, I would like to call upon each of you and every one of you to continue playing your part and to further engage with us in this KIX consortium for the implementation of synergistic and prolific activities which maximize the results on the ground and to ensure that no one is left behind. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rita, for your introductory remarks. So let me take this junction time to invite Ms. Margarita Focas-Leach, Chief Executive Partnership with the Global Partnership for Education, to give her remarks as well. Thank you, Margaret, for joining again our second webinar as part of the KIX Observatory. Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And honorable ministers, friends and colleagues from the African Union, African Development Bank, ADEA, UN agencies and other partners, it's really a great pleasure to join you today at this important meeting. And I bring warm greetings from Alice Albright, the CEO of the Global Partnership for Education. We're here today to share evidence and experiences from policies and practices that address the impact of COVID-19 on education systems. And this is timely and critical as we watch the evolution of the pandemic across the world. COVID-19 has created the biggest disruption to education we have ever seen. More than a year into the pandemic, some parts of the world are making progress, including through vaccinations, but other parts of the world are still reeling under the impact of the pandemic, and the end seems nowhere in sight. This global inequity highlights the fact that the impacts of the pandemic have not been uniform across or even within countries and populations. Alongside economic and health inequalities, the pandemic has deepened educational inequalities. It is critical to share evidence on effective policies and practices in response to COVID-19, on how to ensure learning continuity, how to address the consequences of school closures, how to provide support, guidance, and training to teachers, and how to effectively prepare for and respond to school closures and reopenings. For these reasons, GPE has invested in the KIX COVID-19 Observatory for Africa, implemented by ADEA together with the Gender Unit of the African Union, CFA, and in partnership with the UNESCO Institute for Statistics. And today we're pleased to welcome everyone to the first KIX Observatory webinar to share experiences. At this webinar, we will learn about emerging evidence on policies and practices in Africa that address the impacts of COVID-19 on education systems. We welcome the recent publication on financing education in Africa during COVID-19, released by the Observatory and supported by the African Population and Health Research Center. At the peak of COVID-related school closures, 1.6 billion learners were out of school, including 810 million in lower-income countries. School closures have interrupted learning and threatened the well-being of children, especially those from vulnerable groups such as girls, refugees, children with disabilities, and children living in poverty. The combined impact of school closures and economic hardship risks pushing millions of vulnerable children out of school. COVID-19 has also placed unprecedented challenges on teachers as they have had to adapt teaching and support to students while also facing the consequences of the pandemic in their personal lives. GPE recognized the threat of the crisis early on, and in the course of a few weeks mobilized more than $500 million to support partner countries to plan and implement education sector responses to the pandemic. This funding continues to help sustain learning for up to 355 million children in 66 countries. The funds help partner countries address equity challenges, including through hygiene and psychosocial support, girls' education campaigns, and alternative school feeding during school closures. The grants also support learning continuity through distance learning, provision of learning materials, and support to teachers to prepare and deliver distance and remedial learning programs. The funds from GPE also support preparations for schools to reopen so that students and teachers can return to safe education facilities. And the GPE grants support partner countries to plan and strengthen education system resilience. But while these and other grants from GPE and others help, much more consequential actions are needed to prevent the COVID-19 pandemic from causing the loss of decades of progress. The pandemic poses a serious threat to education financing. Education spending is likely to stagnate in most countries as they respond to the public health emergency and the broader economic consequences of the crisis. COVID is increasing an already significant annual gap in resources required to reach SDG 4, from an annual gap of 148 billion to up to 200 billion US dollars. Aid to education could fall by up to $2 billion by 2022. So we must advocate for more and better education financing. We must protect domestic financing as the most significant and sustainable form of financing for education. And we must tackle inefficiencies and inequities in spending. These objectives are central to GPE's strategy and financing campaign. A specific goal of the financing campaign is to secure at least $5 billion in five-year donor pledges to the GPE fund. This will enable vital support to partner countries to build strong and resilient education systems. An equally important goal is to ensure that domestic education expenditure is prioritized, protected, and increased in pursuit of the global benchmark of 20% of total public expenditure. We are delighted to have President Kenyatta driving a collective political statement, inviting heads of state and governments from GPE partner countries to protect and increase education financing. He is also calling on bilateral and multilateral donors to work together to expand fiscal space for social sector spending. We are thrilled to see leaders, activists, and citizens across the globe raise their hands for education. And I will now hand over to our partners at ADEA and African Union CFA for their presentation, and we really look forward to an engaging discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Ms. Margarita Focus, for your remarks. We appreciate the efforts that are being made by GPE and country members. This is an important year to all participant stakeholders involved in education. And we definitely believe that the event that GPE is actually busy preparing for the replenishment is going to succeed as we see more countries engage. I acknowledge the point that you made in relation to domestic revenues to support education. And this is really one of the key topics that will definitely be important to discuss during this event in July. Thank you so much for making your time and the remarks. Maintenant, je vais introduire son Excellence le professeur Stanislas Ouara, le ministre de l'Éducation, Alphabétisation et Promotion des langues nationales du Burkina Faso, au nom de tous les ministres membres du Partenariat mondial pour l'éducation. Monsieur le ministre, je vous remercie d'avoir pris le temps de participer à cet événement. Je sais combien vous êtes très pris pendant cette période où vous vous battez avec plusieurs de vos collègues pour arriver à répondre aux attentes du système éducatif, en particulier dans votre pays. Monsieur le ministre, je vais vous donner la parole pour dire un mot d'ouverture au nom des collègues membres du Partenariat mondial de l'éducation. La parole est à vous, monsieur le ministre.
Merci beaucoup, Excellences, Messieurs et Madame les ministres et représentants. Madame la représentante du Partenariat mondial pour l'éducation que nous venons d'écouter, chers membres du Partenariat mondial pour l'éducation, chers participants, je me réjouis de participer à cette réunion virtuelle qui nous permet de partager nos expériences et aussi et surtout de mutualiser nos politiques et pratiques dans le cadre de la riposte à la COVID-19 dans nos systèmes éducatifs respectifs. Alors, depuis l'apparition de la pandémie de la COVID-19 l'année dernière, les gouvernements africains ont pris des décrets, des décisions d'urgence à l'échelle de leur pays dans le cadre de la réponse mondiale contre cette pandémie, parmi lesquels la fermeture de tous les établissements d'enseignement public et privé, scolaires et même universitaires. Et cette situation, en particulier en Afrique subsaharienne, a exacerbé les défis persistants dans la gestion de nos systèmes éducatifs, car comme vous le constatez, dans cette partie du monde, donc, il y a énormément de défis, des défis liés à l'accès, donc l'insuffisance de salles de classe, des défis liés à l'incidence des ressources humaines, à la qualité des ressources humaines, à l'accès aux intrants, que sont donc les matériels pédagogiques et tout. Et donc à cela s'est ajouté donc ce défi sanitaire qui a provoqué la fermeture de tous les établissements. Et cela a donc exacerbé, comme je le disais, les défis persistants dans la gestion des systèmes éducatifs. Cela a créé aussi des conséquences négatives sur le bien-être des apprenants et cela a accru la vulnérabilité des groupes marginalisés, en particulier les filles et les femmes et surtout les personnes en situation de handicap. Comme vous avez déjà été informés, donc les sujets de discussion aujourd'hui sont le financement de l'éducation, le bien-être des élèves et des enseignants et la réouverture des écoles pendant ces moments difficiles. Ces sujets sont capitaux, surtout dans le contexte de crise liée à la pandémie à COVID-19. Compte tenu de l'impact socio-économique actuel que la pandémie a dans les 41 pays partenaires du Partenariat mondial pour l'éducation en Afrique, le consortium dirigé par l'ADA présentera donc à travers ce webinaire les preuves que l'Observatoire KIX a obtenu jusqu'à présent sur le financement de l'éducation, le bien-être des enseignants et des apprenants, ainsi que la réouverture des écoles dans les pays partenaires du Partenariat mondial pour l'éducation en Afrique. Nous savons tous combien la planification de l'éducation est importante pour garantir l'accès, garantir la qualité, garantir l'équité et surtout garantir l'inclusion dans nos systèmes éducatifs. La réalisation de ces priorités appelle à la mobilisation des moyens financiers, surtout dans cette situation de crise qui exige notamment d'appliquer des mesures barrières dans nos écoles pour éviter la contamination des élèves et enseignants. Donc, ça va nécessiter la construction supplémentaire de salles de classe pour pouvoir diviser et éviter qu'il y ait une surpopulation des élèves qui ne favorise pas donc le respect donc, de la distanciation physique, la disponibilité en eau potable pour favoriser le lavage des mains, etc. Et en même temps, donc, de se préparer à une éventuelle crise à l'avenir pour éviter de se retrouver dans une situation de crise similaire à celle que nous venons de connaître. Je voudrais aussi profiter de cette occasion pour remercier les organisateurs de cet événement virtuel, en l'occurrence donc l'Association pour le développement de l'éducation en Afrique, ADA, et le Centre national de l'Union africaine pour l'éducation des filles et des femmes en Afrique, UACFA, et le Partenariat mondial pour l'éducation en tant que partenaire financier de l'Observatoire donc, sur les réponses au COVID-19 dans les systèmes éducatifs en Afrique. Pour terminer, je voudrais encore une fois de plus réitérer mon soutien et mon engagement au nom de mes collègues ministres, membres du Partenariat mondial pour l'éducation, pour les différentes initiatives prises par le Partenariat mondial pour l'éducation afin de promouvoir la mutualisation des politiques et pratiques pendant cette crise donc, de COVID-19. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, Son Excellence, Monsieur le ministre Stanislas Ouattara. C'est donc un plaisir, comme je le disais, de vous avoir avec nous. Tout à l'heure, après la présentation, vous aurez l'occasion de partager l'expérience du Burkina Faso. Il y a pas mal de choses, d'après le rapport que nous avons, que votre pays a essayé de mettre en place pour, comme riposte à l'impact de COVID-19 dans le système éducatif. Alors, sans tarder, je vais passer la parole à deux présentateurs qui, donc, nous commençons la partie, je dirais, la partie technique de cette réunion. Donc, je vais passer la parole à deux présentateurs qui vont nous faire une synthèse des grandes lignes des résultats des deux études qui ont été conduites, notamment l'étude sur le financement de l'éducation et aussi le bien-être des élèves et des enseignants. I'm going to introduce my colleague Shem Bodo, Senior Program Officer of ADEA, and Ms. Maria Mdachi, Gender Expert under the AU CFR. They are the two who are going to make the presentation. Shem and Maria, could you make sure that you cover your slides in 20 minutes maximum so that we can actually make sure that we manage properly the allocated time? The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Albert, Honorable Minister, senior officials, partners, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to take the first part of the presentation, and then I will hand over to Maria to finish the second half. Now, in terms of the outline, we are going to take you through the introduction and background. Mambi, next slide. And then we'll look at the funding priorities of the GP African partner countries during COVID-19, and look at the sources of funding from both government as well as external. We look at the country responses to financing education during COVID-19 and touch a bit on emerging evidence on the impact of financing, both positive and negative. Then grab the gender lens and reflect on financing really in terms of gender. And finally, we shall come up with challenges and recommendations. Next slide. So countries have been experiencing different challenges with education financing even before COVID-19 came. So COVID-19 just deepened the challenges, especially on continued operation of education systems, as well as on the well-being of learners and teachers. And in response, countries have had to make difficult choices in reprioritizing areas of funding for the sector and to seek partner support to complement government efforts. And depending, of course, on their stability and sources of financing, and bearing in mind the immediate and critical needs of sectors such as health and social protection. So available evidence, as shown in the synthesis report, shows us that the GB African member countries focused funding during the COVID-19 period in 4 priority areas. First is on remote learning during school closures. The second part is on teacher training on the use of remote learning technologies, including instructional delivery and remedial teaching. The third area of priority is the provision of water, sanitation, and hygiene materials, personal protective equipment, as well as other resources to prepare schools for reopening. And finally, the fourth area is supporting vulnerable populations, especially we are looking at children with special needs, girls from marginalized areas, as well as refugee populations. It's important to note that the proportion of funding for these areas, of course, varied from country to country, depending on the context, and also the stage of implementation of some of these areas by the different countries. So let us look on the next slide at the sources of funding. And we see that, of course, we had funding from domestic sources. And this is looking at government budgetary allocations to ministries of education, as well as revising the programming that was there before COVID came through. And this was part of the government's emergency response measures and looking at how to provide special provision to education for COVID-19 responses in education. In terms of the external sources, we of course had supporting partners, development partners in terms of assistance through grants or loans, focusing quite a bit on the 4 areas, including teacher training, WASH, remote learning, and of course, vulnerable groups. And we have a myriad of partners in the different areas, as we will see in the next slide. And also we had private sector coming in through in-kind contributions. And especially we saw IT and telco companies providing free airtime to learners for radio and TV school broadcasting, as well as also digital learning tools or subsidized internet costs so that learners can access a course material. And then, of course, a very important constituency is the households, where they provide funding through in-kind and direct payments to cover school fees, to look at face masks for the children, and also to look at issues around especially meals now that the school feeding programs had closed, and also just general childcare. Overall, we see that government funding has helped to bolster internet access, to offer alternative learning solutions, especially radio and TV, and also to develop teacher capacities for remote teaching. When we combine it with partner funding, we see that financing education has played and continues to play an integral role in providing students, teachers, and parents with psychosocial support services, as well as WASH-related support for the school reopening period. So we want to look in the next slide at a snapshot of the countries that benefited from funding, the 4 areas of funding, as well as the partners involved. And as you can see on the figure, we had for remote learning, you can see several countries from Burkina Faso to Zambia having put in initiatives in this particular area. And of course, the partners involved, GP being one of them, as has been highlighted by the representative here. And of course, we have other partners, the World Bank, UNICEF, Education Cannot Wait. And this then spans across. When you go to teacher training, really we have several countries, including the Central African Republic, Ghana, Kenya, South Sudan, Uganda, and Zambia are benefiting in partnership with government from partners such as the Belgian Development Agency, of course, GPE, UN OCHA, and OECD. In the area of wash materials and related resources, we saw a good number of countries, including Burundi, Chad, Ethiopia, Lesotho, Mauritania, Mozambique, Sierra Leone, and Togo, putting in initiatives with this financing from GPE, Education Cannot Wait, UNICEF, and World Bank, among others. And finally, in the area of inclusion of vulnerable populations in education, we had UNICEF, Education Cannot Wait, UNHCR, the World Bank, World Food Program, and GPE coming in to support Benin, Cameroon, Kenya, Malawi, Mali, Nigeria, Republic of Congo, Senegal, Togo, and Zimbabwe. So we see that especially for teacher training, beyond equipping the teachers with relevant skills for conducting lessons and accessing their learners remotely using digital technologies, the financing also helped the learners themselves, including vulnerable populations, to adjust to the new normal. So we look a bit deeper into the evidence in the next slide, where we now have the different countries and the different areas. And you can see, for example, that in the first one, under remote learning during school closures, we already see, for example, you have Ghana focusing the financing on content development, enhanced digital library services. We have the three countries, South Sudan, Kenya, and Zambia, getting government support for lesson delivery through radio and TV, as well as provision of tablets for learning. In Burkina Faso, within a tune of $18 million, remote learning was supported through radio and related ICT educational programs, as well as, really important, the provision of remedial programs and support through procurement of wash materials. Cape Verde put in place, together with the partners, around 1 million to strengthen the capacity in the use of radio and educational technologies in remote learning, and also, of course, building the capacity of teachers on the use of digital platforms, and also supporting families with special needs children. In Eritrea, the funding was used to promote remote learning, again, via radio and TV, as well as teacher training, and also supporting the learners and provision of learning materials such as textbooks. In the area of teacher training on remote learning technologies, we have the example of Uganda, where national teacher training colleges were introduced to ICT tools, as well as educational practices and skill sets. And this really enabled the teachers to use the technology, not only for remote learning during the pandemic, but also to maintain communication with students and to continue tapping into the students' creativity to deliver educational content. A similar support in terms of capacity building of teachers took place in Kenya, Ghana, South Sudan, and Zambia. In Central African Republic, in this particular priority area, the support included provision of remote learning solutions, again through radio-based learning kits. Teachers were trained on gender-based violence and in addressing learners' psychosocial and mental health needs, so that really we can address the trauma that many of the learners face, and especially girls. In Kenya, about 150,000 head teachers and all their deputies were trained on interactive remote learning. And also support was provided to teachers and curriculum personnel. And also in the same country, Kenya, we had caretakers and parents being equipped with remote learning skills and so as to enable them to offer psychosocial support services to the children. So moving to the second part of the deep evidence, next slide. For the third area of the WASH materials and related resources for school reopening, Burundi focused on constructing and supplying WASH resources and sensitizing people on really how to prevent a COVID-19. Chad was also involved in building WASH facilities, Ethiopia also in installing WASH equipment, and also Sierra Leone, again, WASH equipment, and also targeting initiatives that target 1 million students and 12,000 teachers. In Mozambique, financing was used to provide WASH supplies and measures, including improving toilets for girls and persons with disabilities, providing sanitary towels for girls, and also increasing their enrollment. In Mauritius, the government, together with partners, got rural poor to participate in education through feeding of about 400,000 students. Lesotho also financed the WASH programs in the schools, and Togo promoted hygiene and provision of PPEs for teachers and students in public schools to the tune of $7 million. In the last area of inclusion of vulnerable populations in education, the evidence shows us that Kenya, Mali, Republic of Congo, and Zimbabwe focused on gender equality and inclusivity in their teacher training at this time of the pandemic. Nigeria initiated girls-focused programs, while Mali looked to address the issue of violence on learners by putting in systems to safeguard that, and really with a particular focus on girls. Zimbabwe had gender-sensitive remedial programs initiated, while Benin also had gender sensitization and support programs to learners at risk of dropping out at the tune of $7 million. In Cameroon, the continuity of children's learning in crisis-affected areas was really the focus at a tune of $1.5 million, while Togo's back-to-school program really was in the tune of $7 million. In Senegal, there was the creation of digital safe spaces for girls to not only access fellow peers, but also mentors and valuable information, especially at this time of lockdown. And then in Malawi, support was for distance learning solutions for those in marginalized areas, as well as other vulnerable populations. Finally, the Republic of Congo really focused on the provision of distance learning solutions under this particular priority area of inclusion. Now, in terms of evidence that is currently emerging due to some studies that have been taken on the next slide, we see that a study by World Bank shows that at this time of the pandemic, the countries also took really the opportunity to fund some of those areas of critical need that allow continuous learning and help prepare for safe schools reopening, really by focusing on those remote learning solutions as well as water, sanitation, and hygiene. We see the example, the evidence comes from Rwanda, as well as in Ethiopia, that also took the opportunity to implement infrastructural projects, such as construction of classrooms, so as to reduce overcrowding and also to enhance social distancing. We know also, I think in Kenya, where there was the provision of extra desks, so as to really try and adhere to the health protocols. But a study by UNICEF also indicates that inadequate resourcing to the education sector can cause long-term damage. Because of prolonged school closures, really market disruptions have been caused, which puts at risk the continuity of learning, especially for children from low-income households who normally access low-fee private paying schools. So some of these schools, as we know from the evidence on the ground, may close permanently. Indeed, some have already closed permanently, and this really causes learner displacement and a possible surge in enrollment in nearby public schools, and of course, the loss of income due to employment for teachers. The role of parents and private sector education providers in financing education, especially during COVID-19, also came through in a World Bank study. And the example of Ethiopia is important to highlight, where it engaged with the private schools and agreed that they should put the fee payments on hold and give time to parents really to explore other ways of really paying for the school fees. So this is really important in terms of emerging evidence. So I will stop here and now hand over to my colleague Maria to continue with the reflections on the gender lens in education financing. Thank you very much. Over to you, Maria.
Thank you. His Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, all protocols observed. Next slide, please, Mami. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead, we can hear you.
Thank you, thank you. I would like to begin my reflections on reminding us of the state in which access to the rights to education and opportunities for girls and women in Africa continue to remain a priority. This is visible with the African Developmental Framework for the next 50 years under the Agenda 2063 that continues to aspire for a transformed and inclusive, sustained and integrated socio-economic and political societies where women and youth are empowered and children are cared for and protected. More so, we find that there's a compilation of legal frameworks on the same, regarding the rights of girls and women in education, particularly looking at gender and education, is compiled by CIEFA called the Compendium, which lists 12 such African instruments. I will not name them all. On the slide, you can see some of them, but in particular, I would like to focus on the Continental Education Strategy for Africa and its related gender equality strategy that offers minimum standards for African Union member states to ensure that gender is integrated. And these are featured as 12 strategic outcomes. Next slide, please. The analysis I'm providing here on this slide is looking from 1995 to 2018, rather just prior to COVID, to what we see in terms of access to education. If you look at all female students, regardless of their age, from primary, secondary, and tertiary, divided by the number of the ratio of their male counterparts. From this figure, you can see that at primary level, from the beginning 1995 to 2018, you can see the last line, the last thin line that represents sub-Saharan Africa. There seems to be parity from both female and male learners at primary education. But as we continue, the trend shows for secondary and tertiary to widen. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, this slide does not provide disaggregation by gender, but it shows the overall inequalities to access basic necessities and environments that facilitate learning. And as you can see from the population of 550 million children, that, for example, on the issue of water, access to water, to safe water services, on the first block, you see that 40% were impacted. And that continues further to show that 42% were stunted, and more so, 57% saw the unlikelihood of completing basic education, with a higher level of one or two of these deprivations of well-being, standing at 79%. Next slide. In a nutshell, I would like to take the opportunity to also complement what has already been shared by the earlier presenter on what also works. As our partner from GPE had mentioned earlier, that there was a raise your hand financing campaign from the African continent were presented as a champion, President Uhuru Kenyatta from Kenya, with an estimated 5 billion, which are expected to be raised. And the campaign began in 2020 and will continue. As for the AU CFA, we have launched since September 2020 an Africa Educates Her campaign, on which we want to increase awareness on girls, getting them back to school, proposing strategies, and working with development partners, as well as traditional and religious leaders and the youth on supporting girls' and women's education in the community. So far from this launching, we have received 250 pledges, mostly in kind, to try to support girls basing from 1 to 3 years of education at both primary and secondary levels, so that they remain in school. Next slide, please. This is a summary of what was previously presented, but focusing on what specifically went into supporting gender equality in Africa's educational systems. We looked at, for reopening of schools, what could be the most cost-effective manner of responding for better outcomes for girls. We're looking at gender violence, as is the case provided by the Central African Republic and Nigeria. We looked at water and sanitation, very important. Mozambique has placed efforts on putting up toilets for girls and persons with disabilities, but also provision of sanitary towels, inclusion efforts in Kenya, Mali, Republic of Congo, Zimbabwe, and Benin, focusing more on teacher training and delivery of instruction and learning materials, with Senegal looking at digital safe spaces for girls, whereas Malawi looked at distance learning. Most interesting, we see policy revisions being proposed by Zimbabwe by revising the Education Act for readmission of pregnant school girls, and they have put into their budget 123 million. This was done in February this year. Next slide, please. There are things which could be done better, and probably for public expenditure, integrating more gender equality. And we're looking this as a safety net in the realms of COVID and protection of the girls. As the other spokespersons have already mentioned, domestic financing is very important. I will also propose targeting more of an intersectoral support. And also very important is the data. It seems we're still having issues and gaps in getting numbers of boys and girls who are out of school, how many teachers have been impacted, if it's female or male teachers, due to COVID. The gender responsive education sector planning has taken place in 20 African countries since 2017. And I think they've been trained more than 200 participants, but I think probably the scaling for this would be good so that there's consistency and continuity. Finally, we would propose that African education systems might have to be rethought in terms of its curricula and delivery, looking at how education is delivered from face-to-face to remote learning, including bringing in a new dimension, a strategic approach for addressing gender equality under gender intelligence. Next slide. I think I will not speak to this, but probably bring in my co-presenter to finalize on this one. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria, for your contribution. Shem, can you take us through quickly in the challenges and recommendations as we wrap up this?
Yes, thank you, Albert. So even though governments, development partners, private sector players, and households have mobilized different amounts of funding for the 4 priority areas we have talked about, as we can see, this funding is not adequate to address the efforts of the pandemic, especially for the education sector, so as to allow for safe school reopening, particularly in the low and lower middle income countries. So challenges of inadequate resources to support the continuity of learning still persist, especially during school closures. And really for preparation of schools for reopening, that remains a challenge. Also, over-reliance on external funding, especially for emergency responses, is a challenge, especially with the hard-hit economies, which we know many of our African countries are in that category. Then budgetary allocation to public health is a positive move, but it has led to cuts in education and other sectors. So that we see also as a challenge. Debt repayment, and of course, other competing national priorities that impede the financing of education is a challenge. And of course, the pre-existing challenges that have hampered the allocation of resources to the education sector. So what does the report recommend? First, there's need to allocate more domestic resources to create sustainability in financing emergency responses. When we are talking about reliance, credibility, and resilience. Secondly, we need to demonstrate how all emergency funding responses enhance equity and inclusion in education. Third, there is need to seek and support major investments in education technology, as well as remote learning infrastructure, especially in hard-to-reach areas and states in transition, where the learners have little or really no access to offsite learning. Second, finally, but not really last, consider canceling external debts or making them conditional upon support to education. And lastly, direct financing should be considered to improve human capacity in education systems so as to better respond to crises such as COVID-19 in future. This really concludes our presentation. Thank you very much. Back to you, Albert.
Thank you so much, Shem, and thank you again, Maria, for your comprehensive presentation. I saw in the chat some participants are requesting to get access to the presentation, so we'll definitely publish the presentation as soon as the webinar is over. So no worry on that. So let's proceed with the next session, which is the roundtable. I would like to first introduce Ms. Julie Dichuru. She's the head of communication and public relations with MasterCard Foundation. Julie, thank you for accepting. I know how busy you are, so thank you for accepting to moderate the roundtable session. So we will have in the roundtable the Minister, Honorable Minister Stanislas Ouattara from Burkina Faso. We also have the representative of the Minister of Uganda, Ms. Jane, who will be representing the minister. Unfortunately, we've been trying to connect the Minister of Malawi. She's really up-country, it's the up-country. She's getting difficulties to connect. So we will not really have her in this meeting, but I see somebody from Malawi is attending, but cannot actually be part of the roundtable session. So Julie, let me pass the floor to you to moderate the roundtable session with the two panelists. Will take about maximum between 20 and 30 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Albert. It's a great pleasure to be with you all and to help guide this discussion, in particular because the MasterCard Foundation has been supporting education in Africa for 13 years. We continue to do this. And so here as a partner, here also to listen and to learn so that we can have greater impact on this continent when it comes to education. So really jumping into the why and the objectives of this session, we are here to share emerging evidence. We really want to ensure that we can catalyze the process of peer learning and knowledge exchange. We want to collect feedback, and we want to ensure that we can then make a call to action with better prioritization of the key needs that have been identified. So a very big thank you, Minister Ouattara and Dr. Jane for being here for this conversation. We're going to jump straight into it. And really, the first thing we want to understand is your experience in country in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. You know, we've heard the impact observation and feedback from the experts delivered earlier, but we really want to get a sense. What did you go through as a country? What was top of mind for you and what were you grappling with? Minister, let me begin with you on this one.
Ok, merci beaucoup. Pour ce qui est de l'expérience du Burkina Faso, il faut dire que lorsque la pandémie est survenue, c'est le 9 mars 2020 que nous avons connu les premiers cas. Et nous étions pratiquement à la fin du deuxième trimestre, parce que l'année scolaire est divisée en 3 trimestres. Nous étions pratiquement à la fin du deuxième trimestre. Et donc, nous avons essayé donc d'achever le deuxième trimestre qui devait s'achever le 14 mars, afin d'avoir au moins 2 trimestres achevés et puis, en fonction de la situation, décider. Mais malheureusement, il y a eu tellement de pression que nous avons dû fermer tous les établissements une semaine avant la fin du deuxième trimestre. Et maintenant, dès que c'est fermé, il faut travailler à la reprise des activités. Alors, le développement du numérique permet effectivement de favoriser les apprentissages à distance et à domicile surtout, mais malheureusement, nous avons, avec la fracture numérique, donc des difficultés pour que par ce canal-là, nous puissions donc évaluer les élèves et les apprenants. Parce que tout le monde n'a pas accès à Internet, tout le monde n'a pas accès à la télévision, tout le monde n'a pas accès à la radio. Mais c'est des dispositifs qui permettent de maintenir en tout cas le maximum d'élèves. Donc, nous avons pris l'option de développer donc des contenus numériques, des contenus par la radio, des contenus par la télévision, pour permettre donc aux élèves donc de pouvoir donc apprendre à distance en attendant que des possibilités de reprise d'activités physiques permettent qu'ils reviennent à l'école. Et nous avons commencé à réfléchir sur des mécanismes à mettre en œuvre pour que, à côté donc du développement des TIC, des technologies de l'information et de la communication pour l'éducation, nous puissions ramener les élèves en respectant les mesures barrières. Ça n'a pas été évident parce qu'il fallait concevoir, il fallait mettre à disposition des élèves des cache-nez. Alors, on n'était pas à mesure financièrement de faire face à l'acquisition de cache-nez jetables, des cache-nez utilisables une seule fois. Et puis, de toute façon, à cette période, il y avait un déficit au niveau mondial. Donc, nous avons pris l'option de confectionner nous-mêmes les cache-nez en utilisant donc les matières premières locales, de façon aussi à permettre aux populations de bénéficier donc des ressources que nous allons injecter dans la lutte contre la pandémie pour la reprise des activités, de bénéficier aussi des ressources parce que les activités économiques aussi étaient au ralenti un peu partout avec les confinements qu'on avait décrétés. Et donc, nous avons utilisé la cotonnade burkinabé pour confectionner les masques et nous avons confectionné 12 millions et demi de masques pour mettre à disposition des élèves. Mais le temps de la confection a été un peu long parce qu'il fallait que les tisseuses donc de ces tissus avec le coton burkinabé puissent se mettre s'organiser. Il fallait que les tailleurs puissent s'organiser pour la couture, etc. Et donc, ça n'a pas été facile. Il y a une confédération du coton, du textile, de l'habillement qui est là, qui a accompagné le processus. Et donc, nous avons pris l'option à un moment donné donc de sauver au moins l'année scolaire pour les classes d'examen, de faire en sorte que ces élèves-là puissent prendre part aux examens dans les mêmes conditions que les années précédentes. Et maintenant, pour les classes intermédiaires, bon, les évaluer sur la base des 2 trimestres effectués et puis essayer de rattraper l'année suivante, donc l'année scolaire de ces classes intermédiaires. C'est ce que nous avons fait. Et dès le 1er juin, nous avons repris les cours avec les classes d'examen en leur partageant les cache-nez et tout. Et on a pu faire les examens dans de bonnes conditions et les résultats étaient meilleurs que ceux de l'année d'avant. Pourquoi? Parce qu'il y a eu un encadrement de proximité. Les enseignants qui ne tenaient pas des classes d'examen ont été appelés en renfort pour appuyer les enseignants qui étaient dans les classes d'examen. Et donc, le ratio élève-enseignant a été formidable et a permis, et à côté de cela aussi, l'apprentissage à distance et à domicile par la radio, la télévision et le numérique éducatif ont permis aussi d'améliorer. Et à la rentrée, nous avons déployé une stratégie donc, de rentrée scolaire en lien avec la COVID et de poursuite des activités pédagogiques. Donc, tout le monde a repris. On a pu distribuer les masques à tout le monde. C'est des masques réutilisables et lavables. Hein, et on a pu les partager. Et puis, bon, on a mis un dispositif de lavage des mains un peu partout où c'était possible. Et on a demandé l'accompagnement des parents d'élèves. Et nous avons repris les cours. Les 2 premiers mois, nous avons demandé de rattraper les retards et puis après de poursuivre l'année scolaire. Et nous avons mis un dispositif de suivi et de prise en charge des cas de COVID dans les établissements. Lorsqu'un cas de COVID apparaît, nous ne formons pas l'établissement, nous isolons donc en quarantaine l'élève concerné, et les contacts aussi sont prélevés régulièrement, et ceux qui sont positifs sont mis en confinement pendant 2 semaines, le temps de revenir, et les cours se poursuivent, et nous gérons cette situation jusqu'à maintenant. Et là, nous sommes presque à la fin de l'année scolaire 2020-2021. Il nous reste, on va dire, les cours s'arrêtent le 21 juin, puis les examens commencent bientôt. Et donc, je peux dire que tout se passe assez bien. Mais la grosse difficulté, c'est que les budgets ont baissé parce qu'il fallait faire face aussi à la crise économique et donc à relancer certaines entreprises, à accompagner certaines personnes. Et donc, du coup, les budgets ont un peu baissé. Et c'est là où nous appelons les partenaires à nous accompagner pour faire face donc à cette situation, pour nous permettre, par exemple, de démultiplier les salles de classe pour pouvoir respecter les mesures de distanciation physique, pour pouvoir faire des forages dans les écoles, pour que les élèves puissent avoir de l'eau pour se laver les mains, et puis pour avoir donc développé le numérique éducatif, parce que nous avons décidé de créer une radio-télévision éducative au Burkina. Donc voilà l'expérience que je partage. En tout cas, l'année scolaire se passe en lien avec la COVID assez bien. Il y a quelques perturbations, mais ça, c'est la fronde sociale. Mais donc, ça se passe assez bien maintenant au Burkina. Merci.
Thank you for that, Minister. My second question was really going to be some of the priorities, for the financing, and you've highlighted those. You need more infrastructure to allow for the physical distancing. You've spoken to some of those issues. So thank you for that. Dr. Jane, let me come to you now and the Uganda experience. What was it like for you in country?
Thank you very much. Everyone on call, protocol observed. We've had very disturbing period. I should start from there. you will recall that actually Uganda was most hit in March 2020. And when that happened, the schools were closed in March, around the 20th. But the way it came, because it took us time, first of all, to get cases in the country. So people initially took it lightly. And then when it finally hit around that March, and then the schools were closed all of a sudden, it definitely found us not ready. And so you can imagine the panic that was there just around the closure. We could not prepare the schools to close. We could not prepare the students to continue. We could not prepare the teachers to continue the support. We just closed the schools. However, we had 2 days to close the school because the president announced the closure on 18th and we were supposed to close on 20th. So what happened immediately was that weekend, when we were within those 2 days, we had to tell the teachers if there are any materials that are ready, just give the children, they go with. And we did not have the communication capacity really to continue anything. So there was a lot of confusion around the time, but yes, we closed. And then the students had to stay at school. The children stayed at school up to October. That's when we opened for finalists. The rest of that time they were at home and up to
at home.
Yeah, at home. Even as I speak now, some of them are still at home. Because what happened was now when we opened for the candidate classes, we were now conscious of the infrastructure that we have. We couldn't accommodate everyone. So we agreed that we will now open in stages. So we opened for the candidate classes. Then later on in March this year is when we now opened for the others, also in stages, when some of the candidates have already gone out. So we've had that difficulty. But what happened was immediately now after the closure of schools, then we now went into preparing education response plan. The response plan was also difficult to implement because we did not know what was ahead of us. We first prepared a response plan for 1 month. We thought the closure would be 1 month. And so we were saying, how do we accommodate students within this 1 month? And so we went into trying to prepare materials for the students to keep them during that time. And we thought it would just send these materials to their homes and they would continue learning. But of course, that also had its very many challenges. The parents were not ready for them. The children were not ready to learn on their own. The teachers were nowhere to be seen because everybody was on a lockdown. And it was even difficult to get these materials right up to their homes. So it was total challenge at the point. We thought the lockdown was 1 month. The lockdown continued and continued up to almost 9 months. And so when eventually we opened for the candidate classes in August, in September, within the time of confusion, we were able to prepare some learning materials, home study materials. The 1 month ended. Now the material that we had planned earlier was for 1 month. But later on now we had to expand because we saw we were not ending with 1 month. So we again went into a second stage of preparing home learning materials to keep the children. So we have been in that process. Overall, we prepared learning materials, and up to now, some of them are are still home and are using some of the learning materials. Up to now, some of the learning materials have not reached. So it has been a challenge generally of getting continuity of learning. We were very happy and very lucky that under GPE, we were able to get some funding. We got 14.7 million US dollars that we now devoted half of actually on continuity of learning. We were able to produce more materials and send out to the children to continue learning. Part of that money, the remaining part of the money, we continued now to prepare for the opening of schools, and we have been doing that. So we gave what we call grants to schools to prepare water, the sanitation, and the masks and all that for children as they return to school. It hasn't been very easy, because also of the challenges of infrastructure. We were not able to bring everybody, as I have already said. So we bring them in bits, and those bits and others are still at home. So while you're thinking of how to open the schools, how to maintain those that are school, you're also thinking about those that are at home. And it has generally been a very big challenge. But we want to appreciate the partners that we have got. We also had a lot of support from UNICEF, from UNESCO, from GPE, of course, as I've mentioned, from USAID, from Education Cannot Wait. You know, we went into those refugee communities with Education Cannot Wait and the UNHCR and all those, and we have had a lot of support going forward. Now, what we have done also as government, with the resources that have been sent to the schools, we are saying reorganize your budgets, because now you have to, this has to continue. And we are continuing with monitoring of the SOPs, the standard operating procedures, which the children have to abide by. So that is basically going on. We haven't stabilized yet. We're still in that process. And I think basically I wanted to stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Jain. And I will ask you, if you are able to put on your camera, please do so that we can see you as you speak. That would be appreciated. I want to now focus, thank you so much. Thank you. Wonderful. I want to now focus us forward, you know, really next steps when it comes to what you see as the most pressing policy issues associated with the well-being of learners, teachers, etc. You know, and that will ensure that in these difficult times, our people still are able to learn and to progress, right? And I want to also, as I put this question to you, ask, are we rethinking the world as we knew it? Are we willing to be ambitious enough to say, well, if we're going to continue going through waves of this, do we have to be much more innovative in our approaches? So I come to you with that question on pressing policy issues, and with the lens and the additional question, are we willing to be bold enough and maybe disrupt education to ensure that we can withstand and progress, even if this does continue for a longer period of time? Minister, over to you first.
Oui, tout à fait. Je pense que cette crise sanitaire montre à quel point nous sommes très fragiles et que nous devons repenser effectivement le système et nous adapter à la réalité. En fait, pour ce qui est de nous, nos pays, nos systèmes éducatifs traversent depuis des années des crises. Nous traversons une crise encore plus grave, c'est la crise sécuritaire qui affecte le système, parce que les terroristes exigent la fermeture des écoles et nous avons plus de 2000 établissements fermés. Et donc, on a commencé à réfléchir à comment rendre notre système résilient face à ce défi sécuritaire, et le défi sanitaire s'est ajouté et qui a montré à la face du monde qu'aucun système n'était prêt à faire face à ce genre de crise. Et donc, il faut être audacieux, il faut être ambitieux, mais il faut mettre l'éducation comme priorité. Et ça, c'est extrêmement important parce que notre système éducatif traverse donc une crise de financement, une crise de pertinence du système, d'orientation du système. Donc, il faut qu'on soit audacieux. Comme vous avez dit, il faut profiter de cette situation de crise pour développer des initiatives ambitieuses et audacieuses. Et moi, je verrais mobiliser davantage les partenaires, les gouvernants et tout, sur la question de l'éducation qui est essentielle et qui est fragile et qui mérite d'être choyée et pour lequel il faut une attention particulière. Mais à côté de cela aussi, il faut profiter de cette situation pour développer davantage l'apprentissage à distance. C'est extrêmement important parce qu'aujourd'hui, tout le monde s'est mis, et même nous faisons une conférence virtuelle. Et avant, c'était assez difficile, les gens ne s'y intéressaient pas, tout le monde souhaitait voyager et tout. Je pense que la situation, la crise actuelle nous montre qu'aujourd'hui, c'est pratiquement plus possible. Et donc, nous devons effectivement orienter notre système en utilisant les technologies de l'information et de la communication. Et nous sommes allés vraiment en décidant de créer une radio-télévision éducative. Donc, il y aura les contenus numériques sur notre plateforme de contenu, il y aura la radio éducative, il y aura la télévision éducative pour permettre donc à des élèves qui sont dans toute situation de crise. Ce n'est pas la crise sanitaire, il y a la crise climatique, il y a des intempéries qui font tomber des bâtiments, qui poussent des populations à se déplacer, à s'abriter dans des écoles, empêchant des élèves de pouvoir accéder, et à la crise sécuritaire et tout, et donc la crise sanitaire. Et donc, comme j'ai dit, il faut qu'on soit ambitieux, il faut qu'on sorte des discours et autres, et qu'on agisse vraiment dans ce domaine. Et pour moi, l'urgence aujourd'hui, il y a deux urgences. C'est le financement conséquent pour qu'on puisse mettre en œuvre les mesures barrières dans nos établissements. Mais la deuxième urgence, c'est vraiment développer donc l'éducation à distance. Et ça, c'est important, extrêmement important. Au niveau du supérieur, ça commence à se développer. Il y a des universités virtuelles qui se créent. Quand vous prenez l'exemple du Sénégal, vous avez 50 000 étudiants sur la plateforme, ils sont formés et il faut qu'on aille dans ce sens et réfléchir à voir comment on pourra évaluer nos élèves par l'éducation à distance, l'éducation par la radio et tout. Mais pour cela, il faut régler quelque chose, c'est la fracture numérique. Tant que nos élèves n'auront pas accès à Internet, tant que nos enseignants n'auront pas accès à Internet, comme cela est dans les pays développés, on ne pourra pas effectivement faire face à cette situation. Donc, le débat est ouvert. Moi, je pense qu'il faut être audacieux et puis il faut accepter aujourd'hui d'investir dans les infrastructures de télécommunications, dans les infrastructures du numérique pour nous permettre effectivement de répondre parce que nous avons démontré pendant cette crise-là que nos enseignants sont capables de développer, de scénariser des cours, des contenus numériques, des contenus par la radio et à la télévision. Il nous manque les moyens d'y aller en termes d'accès à Internet, en termes d'accès à des ordinateurs et tout. Et ça, nous pensons que nos partenaires, comme le Partenariat mondial pour l'éducation, peuvent faire du lobbying au niveau mondial de façon à ce que nous puissions réussir cela. Merci.
Thank you so much for that. We need to be audacious and really, you see funding required from two pathways really to implement the protective measures and to develop the distance learning. Thank you for that. Dr. Jane, your thoughts on this?
Thank you so much. For me, I will just go for distance learning. I think that's where we need to go. More than ever before, we realized that we were too behind or probably sleeping. It is only during this time that we realized more than ever before that ICT in education is a must. And therefore now as a country, we are looking at how to bridge the gaps. Because as I mentioned earlier, when this pandemic came, we had to close, even universities had to close. We didn't have anybody learning because nobody had the means of learning, from outside the school. So we are now focusing on digital education and digitalizing all education avenues in the country. In the Ministry of Education and Sports itself, where we belong, we are looking at, we are developing what we are calling the digital agenda for the education and sports sector. And actually, we've already developed this. We are looking at, of course, there are many challenges. We don't have the infrastructure to take the digitalized learning to the institutions. And that is one of the priority areas, working with, of course, the other agencies that are in that area. We have a big challenge of digital skills, the teachers, the learners themselves. So it is going to be a huge investment into the training of teachers and the learners. Of course, the gadgets are another thing. You can have the infrastructure, you can have the teachers and the pupils, but if you don't have the gadgets, then still you can't work. So that flow is still key. Then we have to work on attitude. Because this is now a new thing, even the teachers are running away from it and saying, I would rather do something else after all the suffering they've had over the year. So we've got to work also on the attitude of the teachers and make sure that we continue doing this because we can't do without them. Same with the parents, because this also has to go to the parents. They are the supporters of the children and the supporters of the teachers. So our big problem and our big way forward is really on digital education. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I hope to come to you both with a final comment before we wrap this up. We're going to get some interventions now and some more takeaways. But as we go to hear from Professor Helen Inyega and Dr. Cecilia Balde, let me just challenge all of us in our thinking. And I think we've heard from the minister, we've heard from Dr. Jane, the need for a different approach. But asking the question, even in the old world, did that approach work for us? For the young boy or girl from herder communities, were they accessing quality education? Maybe this is a chance for Africa to really ensure, rather than taking an old model of education which was brought into the continent by the colonial powers. What is the African model that really works for our communities? Are we bold enough to start rethinking education? I will leave us, it's a rhetorical question, I will leave you all thinking that. And let me call now on Professor Helen Inyega, a Director of Early Grade Reading Institute at the University of Nairobi in Kenya. Please do share your thoughts. Thank you. And please switch on your camera as well. Please unmute yourself and switch on your camera. Thank you.
Okay, I'm trying to get to the camera so I could.
Okay, but we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, if the camera messes up, I'll just go ahead and do my, let me see. Anyway,
please go ahead.
I'll just go ahead and comment.
Okay.
Forget about the, let me see. All right, so I wish also to join the other members in thanking the Minister for Education for Burkina Faso, who has given us very good ideas together with Dr. Jane from Uganda. I think we have a very good opportunity in terms of improving our education systems, being able to build back better. And in so doing, I have learned quite a bit of what has happened in those countries, but I think we must recover in a way that we do not replicate the mistakes that have been made before. One of the things that needs to happen, as I've seen the commitment from the Ministry of Education through the minister represented here, is the fact that the government has to be willing to enact some of the reforms and also to innovate for the change in the education sector. So there is that importance of building the political capital, particularly from the Ministry of Education, the buy-in for that reform. So Julie, when you ask about rethinking the education system, disrupting the education curricula and delivery, and Jen talked about adapting the curricula, really Ministry of Education needs to drive that process. Examples from elsewhere prove to us that when the Ministry of Education is driving the process, the change is likely to happen. One of the things that I've been looking to hear in how, for example, to measure learning loss, children have been away from school, they have come back to school. What efforts are there, even as we begin to reimagine the education curricula? What tools are available to assess the learning loss? And more importantly, to tailor make the remedial measures so that our children catch on and progress, so that we minimize the learning loss. I think that is one of the things that we need to look into. Another thing that has come out is the kind of support, being able to isolate ingredients that actually work together to create a culture of good practice and accountability within the education sector in the different countries, in the different GPA countries. What would teacher professional development look like going forward? What are some of the things that we need to do as education specialists in terms of the instructional materials? How can they be repackaged to be able to handle the students at a distance? What is the role of the education sector in providing psychosocial support, for example, to the teachers and the learners? I have had cases in my country, Kenya, where learners are assaulting teachers. It just speaks to some of those issues that are now emerging as we return back to school. Everyone's stress levels seems to be very high. How can we do that? How can we involve the youth? There was the perfect example that was raised by Margarita about the president of Kenya taking up to raise funds, the 5 billion. What is the place of youth in driving education development and education change? What can the youth do in our context, for example? There was a good question in terms of education finance about mobilizing domestic resources. What will that look like for the various countries? In terms of improving effectiveness in funding, how is that going to look like? Or what we call the spending data. How is that going to look like for the various countries? What do we need to put in place so that we capture this data? I know Maria talked about data focusing on girls and boys and attendance in school. What about the spending data? Where are we going to get it from? I know the KIX has the live spreadsheet, which is really a brilliant idea. Are the ministries of education able to latch onto it so that we get real-time information on budget changes in the different countries? What are the budgetary needs in terms of provision of education in the region would be one of the things. And also being able to safeguard. I wish there was a way in which you could ring fence some of the resources that go into education so that they are not being spread. We have to choose between education and health. Is there a way we can ring fence funding that goes into education? We know there's going to be cutback, for example, from the international community. What can ministries of education do to be able to actually bridge that gap without inconveniencing the students involved in the process? And the last thing that I would like to talk about is in terms of ensuring that where ICT is involved. I know Jen has talked very well about embracing technology. It's very good to embrace technology. How do we take care of and narrow the gap, Jane, in terms of the high-tech students, low-tech students, and the no-tech? They don't have technology at all. How do we take care of such students so that no child is left behind? Those would be my contribution. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor, for that. Let me come now to Dr. Cecilia Balde, Regional Education Advisor for West and Central Africa for UNICEF. Please do switch on your video and mic and share your thoughts. Thank you.
I hope you can see me.
We can, and we can hear you clearly.
Okay, I'll just adjust my camera.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity to join you in the reflections on this very important theme this afternoon. I would say, first of all, that I concur entirely with Jane and our other colleagues, the Minister of Education from Burkina and Professor Helen, on the comments that they have made. And I also agree entirely with the presentation on the findings and analysis that has been done on the financing of education. I'll just make a few comments on some of the issues that have been raised. And the first thing for me is that when COVID came along, we were not prepared. And often, there's a lot of work that goes into developing education sector plans, but many of the education sector plans, especially in West and Central Africa, did not have contingency plans for education in emergencies, nor did they have contingency budgets for emergency responses. So the first lesson that anyone can take away is the fact that you never know when it will happen. And for those countries that, like Burkina, that are in emergencies over many years, they know better than all of us that if you don't have contingency plans and you don't have a clear response capacity, then when the time comes for you to respond immediately, it becomes very difficult. So what we then had to do at the very beginning of this COVID pandemic is actually to help to mobilize whatever support, technical support we can mobilize very quickly to help countries to develop their response plans very quickly, cost them out, and develop a phased approach to responding to the realities. Some of the responses have been highlighted by the professor from Burkina Faso. So the lesson to pull away from that is that we need our education sector plans cannot be devoid of contingency plans for education in emergencies. The second point I would raise relates to the fact that we decided at the very beginning that we cannot let COVID reverse the positive trends, that the positive gains that we have actually acquired and gained through education. And therefore, we needed to think outside the box and think about innovating rather than doing business as usual in education and emergency response, which is basically service delivery, providing learning materials, training teachers rapidly so that they can respond. So we did much more than that. And in doing much more than that, we said, okay, so as the Minister of Burkina is saying, what can we do to learn from existing pilots and existing experiences around distance learning? We said we have to diversify the learning pathways. How do we diversify the learning pathways? We don't just, because obviously COVID put us in a position where we cannot do regular didactic teaching and learning between teachers and pupils. So we needed to use other platforms. Radio was being pilot tested. We have a partnership with a South African-based organization that does radio-based learning, very exciting. The Burkina experience tells you about that very well. TV, and then digital learning. And a lot of our focus is now on digitization of the education systems. How do you promote alternative ways of engaging children and supporting them to learn in a way that allows them to achieve and continue to perform? And related to that also is the big issue around the financing. Yes, we have been advocating for increases in domestic resources, but we know that the resources have never been sufficient. African governments in education have not been reaching even the 20% target that has been set over the years by the international community. So what do? We can no longer just say, let us increase education resources. We need to say, where do we look from within the education resources? Where do we look to make changes that are important for us to continue to provide quality learning opportunities? The first thing that hits me when I look at the data in this continent is that we have very low spending in the areas that matter most for fixing the learning crisis. We have a learning crisis on this continent, and the low funding in pre-primary learning, which is only between 2 to 3% across the board in the continent, is something that is going to move us backwards instead of moving forwards. So even within education, the budget for pre-primary learning and for early primary learning is not necessarily going into those areas. And secondly, if ministers of education can ask themselves, who is actually benefiting from the allocated budgets? If you look at the data, it tells you that the low-income countries actually spend only 10% of public education budgets on the 20% of the poorest quintile. And comparing this to the 46% of the budget that is being spent on the 10% most educated in the richest quintile. So if education ministers want to do better, they can look at the spending patterns and reverse these spending patterns to ask those hard questions about how we spend the little that we have. If we just look at the role of states, governments, in terms of what they contribute, in the world, you will find that in our high-income countries, basic education is heavily subsidized by the state, with our households making significant contributions at higher levels of education. This is what you see in America, it's what you see in the UK, where government says, okay, I'm going to concentrate on making sure that basic education is of quality for everybody, but you as parents, you can then put your money in higher education if you want. Why is that? Because the returns on investment are higher in the lower levels for social returns, and therefore government is putting their money there. But then when you look at it in our countries, in our poorest countries, the low-income countries, you find the complete reverse, where you will find, especially in this region, Western Central Africa, you have countries where 70% of the expenditure, the real expenditure in education, is being met by parents and communities. It is not being met by government. So government can make that choice and say, well, our money should actually go to the poorest, and our money should go to the lower levels of learning where the returns on investment are higher, so that everybody benefits from it and we have a win-win situation. Now, if you look at the innovation portfolio, we agreed with all governments, and we are very excited about the idea. We agreed that to deal with the learning crisis, there are 2 or 3 things that have to happen. One, the focus on the early years, that we focus on making children ready to learn by age 5. Every child has to be ready to learn by age 5, and every child has to be able to read in order to learn beyond age 10. So that if we're able to get this right, then we will not be undoing the gains that have been made. For the agenda on reimagining education, we are leveraging world-class digital solutions so that governments can use these to actually develop their digital learning policies and strategies, and ensuring that we can actually think in terms of scale. It's no longer piloting small-scale projects and just wanting to do little bits and pieces here and there, but it's about mobilizing broad-based partnerships to innovate in education, and to not to refuse or shy away from the big problems, to say these big problems have been with us forever. The infrastructure, classroom infrastructure problems, even as you're innovating in classroom infrastructure, the unit costs are higher. They are higher than if you just have a regular classroom. So forget the buildings. Think about the child and the learning that the child has to learn. And finally, there was a point about integrated programming for school health. This is an area, especially during this COVID period, that requires us to look at freshly, to say we need to have our health colleagues on board. We need to have the social protection colleagues on board. We need to have the nutrition colleagues on board. Yes, we are offering health, hygiene, nutrition education, but it's not enough. We need the services around children so that we respond to the needs of the children in holistic ways. Countries like Uganda have been doing this in excellent ways, and we can learn across countries and across regions. And I think this is what I wanted to contribute to this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Such great points, Dr. Balde. Thank you so much for that. I come, as we wind up this session, to Minister and Dr. Jane, just to give us your closing thoughts very, very briefly. As we move forward, what's the one thing you need us to keep top of mind, very briefly, very focused, way forward? I'll begin with you, Jane, and then finish with the Minister. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. For me, again, I just want to emphasize the importance of going digital. Really, if we go digital, we will not suffer the way we suffered when COVID-19 came. We should now get ready so that in case of any other calamity, whatever it is, it may not be COVID this time, whatever comes, we should be ready to ensure that our children are able to continue learning. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you. Thank you. Minister, over to you.
Merci. Je voudrais donc, à la suite de ce qu'a dit donc Dr. Balde, quand même dire que de plus en plus dans nos pays, les budgets alloués au système éducatif par endroits dépassent même la cible mondiale qui est de 20%. Malheureusement, cet investissement de l'éducation va dans le fonctionnement du système, c'est-à-dire les salaires des enseignants et le matériel de fonctionnement. Donc, il n'y a pas d'investissement structurant dans le système éducatif. Et donc, même si nous mettons 30% pendant 20 ans, sans que ces financements soient alignés sur les priorités et les objectifs, on ne va pas réussir. Et donc, c'est pour cela que il faut qu'au-delà des 20% que nous mettons, que ce soit vraiment aligné sur les besoins. Maintenant, ce que je voudrais aussi dire, c'est que je ne pense pas que l'enseignement à distance, le numérique adaptatif va remplacer donc le présentiel, mais ça reste une alternative qui peut justement permettre à notre système éducatif d'être résilient face aux différentes crises, qu'elles soient sanitaires, sécuritaires ou toute autre sorte de crises. Et c'est pour cela qu'effectivement, il faut que notre continent puisse rattraper son retard. Parce qu'on a vu, hein, et c'est clair, il n'y a pas de débat là-dessus, on s'est rendu compte avec la crise sanitaire qu'on n'était pas du tout prêt à affronter des crises de cette nature parce que malheureusement, on a beaucoup tâtonné et hésité. Aujourd'hui, on a montré que face à ces crises, on peut être résilient. Maintenant, il nous faut des ressources pour financer le système, aussi bien pour faire respecter les mesures barrières, pour favoriser l'apprentissage physique, mais aussi pour développer le numérique éducatif, l'école par la radio, par la télévision, comme alternative et permettre vraiment que notre système puisse être résilient face à toutes les crises. Donc, les deux initiatives devraient aller ensemble pour nous permettre d'aller de l'avant. Et pour ça, il n'y a pas de secret, il faut qu'on finance conséquemment l'éducation. Que les États financent, mais aussi que les partenaires se mobilisent pour apporter des financements conséquents et pertinents pour éviter que nous fassions permanemment du saupoudrage qui ne nous permettent pas d'avancer. Je vous remercie.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you so much to all our panelists and our speakers. And just as I hand back to Albert to take us into the next session, the Q&A with Dr. Moses Ngware, let me say that we have no choice but to ensure we succeed on this journey. And really, Africa sits in the hands of the people in this room and your colleagues and compatriots to really step up to the challenge. Let me just say this as I close. We are a partner on the journey, as I mentioned earlier. We have a platform discussing technology and education, EdTech Mondays, which we run in several countries and continentally. And we released the Secondary Education in Africa report last year. We want to hear, we want to help, and we'll continue to be part of these conversations. But as Africans, ladies and gentlemen, we must be part of the change. And we have to get this right. Let's be bold, let's be audacious. With that, Albert, I come back to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you so much, Julie. As always, I like your passion. I like your passion to education, and you have shown it during this event. So I can't agree with you enough. I totally agree. It's important that we rethink education. It's important we work together as countries, because there's so much we can learn from each other. So thank you so much for your wise words and for facilitating this event. So colleagues, we're now moving towards the end of this webinar, but I would like to first ask our colleague Moses, Dr. Moses Ngware, who conducted the research that allows us to come up with the synthesis. Moses, I think there have been a couple of questions or reflections. I'd like to give you 5 minutes to reflect on that and share your thoughts. Moses?
Thank you very much, Albert. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, the panelists and participants and those who have asked questions. I think this has been a very, very insightful discussion and a very good presentations and reflections. On the wall, we have a couple of very, very good questions. And I'm going to very quickly reflect on some of them, not all. The first one is coming from Lutajwaha. And Lutajwaha is asking, how do you manage the situation for children in rural remote areas where the radio and TV cannot be accessed? I think this is very true, if I may confirm from the literature and from the work that we've done out there, from the studies that have been done, from the reports that are coming out. It is true that in remote areas, it's difficult to access radios and TV, both in terms of signals and as well as in terms of ownership at the household level, because of obvious reasons. So how are those kids being reached then, given that in most countries, it was radio and TVs that were the first option in terms of learning continuity. What we see coming out is local NGOs, for example, and community-based organizations. They organized the children, they organized the communities, the groups, and they had even recordings where these things could be played to the children. In addition to that, they did not always have to follow the centralized curriculum, the broadcasting that is coming from the radio and TV. Instead, they went for other innovative ways where they provided whichever learning materials that they had and organized children in groups, and some form of learning was taking place or took place. In other areas, we did have local radios that the local communities and the local CBOs tapped into to ensure that there was some form of learning that was going on. But despite all that, I can confirm that not each and every child, especially within those areas that were reached by the radios and TVs, there was always those limitations. Now, Moses Abiero has asked another good question, and he's asking, my question revolves around financing for early childhood education. What kind of investment did the GP countries extend to ECE programs? And how did the financing for this subsector differ before and during the COVID? Very good question. And I know that Dr. Cecilia from UNICEF did touch on this issue about where do you invest? What are the priorities? Now, how much money goes to which subsector of the education system is a decision that is usually made by the Ministry of Education and other stakeholders. In some countries, there's a lot of focus. In other countries, there's little focus. And I would agree with the person who asked this question, Abiero, about the need to focus on early childhood education, the infants in that. But then the question is, what happens during the time of crisis like this one? And this is where we talk about the inclusivity. This is where we talk about, even as we want to continue with the learning continuity, what are those risks that might come up? What are those areas that we are likely to forget? So that even as we make the response, emergency response plan, what are those areas that we must think about? We want education learning continuity. How about girls and their emotional support and reproductive health services? If we don't address that, then we land ourselves into another problem. The same thing with the ECD. So I agree with this. This is something that we need to think about as government, as stakeholders. However, the research and the analysis is still continuing, and we've not compared the cost before or the budgets before and after. This is still work in progress. Again, we move down to Godwin Aduba. Maybe this is the last one that I will reflect on. Is it possible to develop a unified curriculum for Africa so she can develop simultaneously in a facet of life? This is yes and no, because Godwin, this is very, very interesting and very insightful and visionary. And I think this is where probably AU probably is taking us. We've seen the Agenda 2063 for AU. We've seen the education sector plan for AU 1625, and there is a survey that is going on. And in the process of interacting probably with that process, with that survey, probably these are kind of things that need to come out strongly. But having said that, we do know that our diversity is our richness. Okay, and we were talking about a curriculum that probably is going to be Afri-centric, for example, so that there are so many things that could emerge from Africa. And somebody did say, and I think Julie Parting Short also emphasized on this, and it is about being Afri-centric. There are so many innovations actually that can come from Africa, and having this kind of cross-breeded curriculum, yes, it can support and harness some of these things. However, we also need to be aware of the differences, although we are saying that these differences are the ones that make us rich. So this is a conversation that probably we can interact with while we are interacting with that survey of the education sector that is going on and led by the AU. Let me stop there and take you back to my colleague, probably to reflect on the other questions or take us to the next level. Back to you, Albert.
Thank you so much. I'm actually watching time. We are almost at end of the event. So let me raise a couple of issues that came out of this meeting, particularly three important things that as a takeaway as I close the event. Number one, let's make it clear. Digital, moving totally digital, we don't believe is going to be a solution for our building back better. I think we're looking at a hybrid system of education where the face-to-face remain the primary because of a number of reasons. And I have seen a number of reasons that are actually raised on the chat. Thank you, Hannah, for your points. I think I picked your point that you made, that we need to make sure that we actually continue building and strengthening the face-to-face and use the remote learning as supplement. And this is so important. But in the same time, we need to make sure that access and equity are equally addressed. Otherwise, we will create, again, a huge gap in our education system. So that's really number one. Number two, the issue of financing for education, and I like the point that have been made. Again, we need to look for alternative mechanisms for financing, including making sure that not only the parents, but also the private sector play their parts, because education is really a concern to everyone, not only government, not only parents, but any citizen. As you can see, our countries can only evolve once we fix education. So that's really the basic, and it's so important to consider that important. Lastly, of course, the gender equity. Colleagues from CFA, I think they raised important points. Let's make sure that our girls are brought back to school and are supported as well. So with those few words, I'd like to thank everyone who participated to this event, particularly the panelists and the speakers. Monsieur le ministre, honorable Stanislas, merci beaucoup d'avoir pris votre temps à participer, de partager l'expérience de votre pays. Dear Janet, thank you for sharing the experience of Uganda, but also all participants, the panelists and discussants who contributed to make this webinar successful. So thank you again, and I wish you a nice afternoon, and looking forward to our next Observatory webinar. But in the same time, we have a number of papers that we are publishing through our website on the Observatory. Go and check on a regular basis and share with us contributions from your country's experience. Again, thanks to everyone and see you soon. Bye.
Good. A group picture? Maybe we wanted a group picture.
I forgot to mention the group picture. I hope everyone is still there.
Yes, ask everyone.
Can you switch on your camera so that we have a group picture? Thank you, Rita, for reminding me. Switch on your camera for a group picture, please. Maria, switch on. I see Moses. Dr. Jane, are you still around?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, we want to see your face.
I'm here.
Monsieur le ministre, vous êtes toujours là?
Oui, je suis là.
Voilà. Okay, thank you.
Anuziva, please.
Cecilia.
Yeah,
so,
I got everything. Thank you.
Okay, did you take the picture?
Yes, Albert. It's okay.
Okay, thanks a lot. So thank you, everyone, and looking forward, as I said, to our next webinar. And thank you for your contribution. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 Oh, I forgot to say thank you to interpreters. Sorry for that. Very good job, interpreters. Thank you, Paul. Thanks a lot. And the technical support we got from our colleagues from the African Development Bank. Thank you, as usual. Thanks a lot. Bye.